Hi everyone, this is lecture 6.2. In this lecture we will be continuing our conversations on drug policy. So we'll first address briefly existing attitudes toward drugs, then we will talk about currently existing drug policy and some innovative policy that has been put in place to try to correct some issues surrounding drug sentencing, and talk about how that's gone down a little. So, as we addressed in the first part of this set of lectures, our attitudes toward drugs are based on culture, and culture changes over time. Heroin was once legal in the United States. It was considered part of your legal rights to put heroin in your body if you so chose. Cocaine was once sold over the counter, and that was considered something that you could give your children to deal with their toothaches. On the other hand, in the 1920s, it was considered patriotic and good for people to vote for laws that would make alcohol illegal. And those laws that made alcohol illegal also contributed to making other drugs illegal. But because alcohol was socially significant to Americans, that chemical became legal again, while the other chemicals didn't. Now, in some parts of our country, marijuana is now legal for recreational use, and that is on the state level, and it is a major part of the economy in those states. Notably, California and Colorado are the places that have really developed the biggest marijuana economies in the country to date. In previous eras, though, this major boost to the economy was vilified as being a gateway drug. And it was said, and almost all of this logic has been refuted by scientists, but it's said that a gateway drug is a substance that is believed to lead to harder drugs. Thus, during the 1980s war on drug era, it became commonly believed, because that's what the propaganda told us, that marijuana use would serve as a gateway drug to harder drugs such as cocaine and heroin. The thinking was that if you ever would try marijuana, then eventually you would want to try new and different drugs, because that's what it would drive you to, just by that. So after we put our conversation about drug history into perspective, now let's talk about some general ideas regarding drug policy. So just to define it real specifically, drug policy are those laws and procedures implemented by government to deal with drug use and problems related to that drug use. Different societies have different drug policies. The drug policy in the 1980s is different from how it is today, and both of those are different than the drug policy in the United States in the 1800s, when there was almost no drug policy. Drug policy in Portugal is very different from what it is in the United States. In the country of Portugal, all drugs are legal. That is how they deal with it, and they made that transition, I believe, 10 years ago or so. Since then, they have put their drug enforcement dollars into rehabilitation dollars, and they've created public rehabilitation centers to help people with drug problems, and they've actually found far fewer overdose deaths, and more people are getting better because they're actually treating drug addicts as they are, as people with a medical condition. Mandatory minimum sentencing is a specific type of drug policy that we have in the United States. Sometimes it regards to drugs, sometimes it regards to other types of crimes. Mandatory minimums are definitely a crime control type policy. Thus, when those laws are in effect, we are trying to put people in prison in order to punish them. In terms of drugs, we are telling them to keep them from selling drugs to the outside world. Mandatory minimums have been used to apply certain sentence durations to certain drugs. Most classically, we're often talking about, when we talk about mandatory minimums, applying those to crack cocaine specifically. And as we've discussed, that has had a really negative impact on the African American population, where crack cocaine was most prominent in the 1980s. And these have had really disproportionate impacts on the poor and other minority groups as well. So criminalization is, in the next following slides, we're going to talk about different approaches to drugs, and these different approaches, it's often useful to think of in terms of marijuana, because we have different people, different states, different localities have taken each of these approaches actually in approaching how to deal with marijuana. So it's really easy to think of marijuana in these terms with this criminalization and following different stances on drugs. The reality of the matter is you could take this stance on cocaine, on heroin, on almost any drug. So criminalization is the most restrictive form of drug policy. So under this, the production, manufacture, sale, possession, consumption of certain drugs, any kind of production or possession of this drug is illegal. And while marijuana specifically is legal in many states and localities, it remains criminalized in the United States on the federal level. So because marijuana is criminalized on the federal level, for the first couple years of California's legalization, both medicalization and for recreational use, there were occasional raids by federal officers in an effort to politically punish the state effectively. Those have become dramatically less common now, but it still would be legal for federal officers to go into downtown Los Angeles or go other places, to go to one of the dispensaries here in Columbus, Ohio, or places in California, and take all of their marijuana and close down that operation. But that is becoming, as our society becomes more accepting of marijuana use, increasingly not politically advantageous. And it's important to remember that a lot of what drives the laws that happen in our country are unfortunately driven by politics. Now, decriminalization is almost the opposite of criminalization, right? So decriminalization is the process of removing some form of conduct, in this case drug use, previously defined as criminal, from the jurisdiction of criminal justice agencies. So basically with decriminalization, we're making something that was illegal, legal. Real common examples in the modern era are drugs, and often when we talk about sex work, in some areas have made sex work illegal. So that's pretty much what you think it is. And decriminalization can take many forms, though. Depenalization is another term or a different approach that could be taken to decriminalization. For example, with depenalization, we could do something like writing a ticket for possession of more than 1 pound of marijuana. That's what we're looking at there. So what we're doing is taking the penalty out of the thing. We are so that it cannot result in incarceration. I'm sorry, I mispronounced it there for a second. Depenalization, right? We're not taking the penalty away. Sorry to make that confuse you on that. We are taking the penalization away from it. We're taking the prison out of the equation, basically making it a parking ticket type offense. De facto legalization is something that has taken hold in a lot of places in terms of marijuana policy on how police actually do their jobs. What happens with depenalization, I'm sorry, Sorry, guys, I had to let my dog out of the room. What happened with de facto legalization is that uh, really it's giving police the ability to treat it how they want to. If the given police officer wants to let you go for a marijuana, they'll just let you go. If they, because it's not really worth their time, but if they do want to punish you for it and they want to lay down the law at you, they can do that too. And that's been happening in a lot of parts of this country for quite some time. De facto legalization is kind of frightening because it basically is still continuing. Yeah, let's have this. Let's have this thing, but not necessarily, treat it absolutely equally. It gives so much discretion to actual individual law enforcement officers. And as a sociologist, I wonder if this kind of treatment of the law doesn't result in letting off privileged kids go while less privileged kids wind up serving time in jail for this sort of thing. So it's not really something that I like all that much because of its lack of fairness, but it is one approach that people have taken. Legalization, in which some or all drugs become legal. This is what they have done. That's different from decriminalization because the thing actually becomes fully legal. Under certain circumstances in a legalization, drugs can be highly regulated. They can be put out by government vendors and consumed. All criminal and civil penalties are removed, but certain penalties for certain intoxicated behaviors remain in place. So, for example, marijuana is highly legalized in the state of California, highly regulated in the state of Colorado, and there are other states. And in those places, it still remains illegal to drive under the influence of marijuana. And that is how it is in all states, right? So effectively, we treat it in a way very similar to how we treat alcohol. There are certain regulations that are used, but there's no actual risk of being put in prison by the state there. Now, let's talk about some of the more innovative policies that have been used in this regard. So, some innovative policies classify as being harm reduction policies. These are policies or procedures that are intended to help the drug user from hurting themselves, and even if that allows for continued abuse. So, these harm reduction policies are purely aimed at trying to keep people from getting hurt, right? One classic example is providing heroin users with clean needles. So what that allows to do is it does allow the person to keep using the drug, but it reduces the spread of blood-borne illnesses such as HIV, such as other diseases that are often sexually transmitted, but many sexually transmitted are also blood-borne. So that is a really great example of harm reduction. Another good example of harm reduction is supplying people who we know come in contact with heroin users or opiate users with a drug called Narcan. Narcan across the country is becoming more available in areas for this reason. When Narcan is applied, it's a nasal mist. It stops the overdose of the actual drug. It is not an intoxicant in any way. Narcan just stops the uptake of the drug into the brain, and when a actual overdose is occurring, it will keep the person from going into a coma and dying. Effectively, what overdoses often do. Drug court is another innovative policy that has mixed opinions about it. It is an alternative court system set up for those with minor drug offenses. So if you are put in court, you are a person that doesn't have a criminal record, but you get come in because of for some drug use, you would be a candidate for drug court. It allows most offenders to avoid prison while requiring them to participate in both education and rehabilitative programming. So, on the surface, it sounds like something that could really work. But there are some critics of drug courts that say it does both mesh tightening and net widening. So, you think of a big net catching fish. Well, if the mesh is tighter, you catch smaller and smaller fish, and don't let those fish escape, right? So it creates increased formality and intensive monitoring of drug court clients. So by creating these rules, these strict rules, it makes it more difficult for some candidates to be able to actually escape the court system because they have to come in and report to the parole officers. But if they have to report to parole officers, it becomes hard for them to maintain their jobs. It becomes hard for them to maintain their jobs. They can't report to the parole officers. And then that becomes a problem in and of itself. And then if the person is coping with addiction problems, then maybe that could cause them to turn back to the drug, right? It becomes a really thoroughly vicious cycle. Net widening, then, is the broadening of the criminal justice system in a way so as to increase the number of individuals who are brought into the system. So drug courts have been accused of net widening in terms of, well, if police officers know that certain drug users that would be dismissed by normal courts, but if those users would be able to be processed by the drug courts, then these people might be brought in for something that they wouldn't have been punished for or addressed otherwise. Thus, it creates a greater burden for the general court system as a whole, and thus drug courts could become a problem. There are some drug courts that are very effective. There are some drug courts that are less effective. The whole thing is, as with all things, and I say this over and over again, it's about nuance. It's about details and the lived situation. Finally, another bit of innovative policy was the Fair Sentencing Act that was passed under the Obama administration. Under the Fair Sentencing Act, the gap between crack and powder cocaine sentencing were narrowed. So, as I mentioned, during the crack scare of the 1980s, an equivalency ratio of 100 to 1 was put in terms of sentencing severity relating to crack cocaine and powder cocaine. So, what does that 100 to 1 ratio mean? Well, if you had 1 ounce of crack, which is still a massive amount of crack, you were treated as if you had 100 ounces of powder cocaine, right? Now, 1 ounce of crack is an amount of crack that a low-grade drug dealer would have. That's not what a drug user would do. We're still talking about drug dealers, right? But what they're then doing is taking that 1 ounce of crack and punishing that 1 ounce of crack person as if they were a powder cocaine dealer who had 100 ounces of powder cocaine. And if someone has 100 ounces of powder cocaine, then they're at least a medium time, if not big time, cocaine dealer, right? That's a big deal. The Fair Sentencing Act adjusts it, scales it back from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. I suspect that when it was put into place, that was a matter of making the disproportionality of it. Well, okay, we'll compromise about it. We'll make it 18 to 1. We won't make it 1 to 1. And this is despite the fact that crack cocaine is actually still chemically diluted cocaine, right? Crack cocaine is cocaine that has been mixed with baking soda. You can make a simply massive amount of crack cocaine with powder cocaine. So it's not a perfect law, but it's a law that goes toward making things a little bit more fair for people with addiction issues, and for people, for a lot of people that are trying to get their life back together. Yeah, so that has been this presentation, and let me know, as always, if you have any questions.